Kideaters vs. Zoo BoyZ, Chapter 4, Knocking on Literature's Door. Back in the Sarasota County Youth Detention and Correctional Center, known to most as the Jail for Kids, John Minor was happy to be drawing while Ron was happy to be writing. Dave was doing more push-ups, sit-ups, and bench presses than he ever dreamed of, while Jeremy, when he wasn't dreaming of John's sister, was just observing everyone and wondering how he was going to survive living in this strange environment. He often thought, these characters are far stranger than the monsters we saw in Zoo Island, eh? Because Ronnie was their author, he had to sit down and try to capture not only what had happened on Zoo Island, but what was happening now in their individual cells at the juvenile jail. The boys were glad they were at least in the same cell block, even though they were in different cells within that block. They often sit together when they could. At one point, John admitted his own admiration for Jeremy's sister. It was at that point that Jeremy finally felt safe enough to admit his own private mad crush on John's sister. Jeremy thought he had been hiding his feelings, but his buddies already knew Jer was head over heels, stuck on Karen. When Dave chimed in asking John, "Bruh, you like Jeremy's sister April? Dude, she's like 8 years old, you perv." Dave was loud. His voice echoed off the hard, bare concrete walls of the cell. John looked around to see who might have honed in on their private meeting around one of the several tables and benches that were bolted to the floor. John clarified, "No, Karen, not April." Dave went on, bellowing, "Ha! That's just as bad. Karen's like 28. Dave assaulted John again. "You perv!" Karen was only 18, just barely 3 years older than John, but no matter what, Dave was going to mock him. Although Jeremy had already said it, he was so relieved to unload his secret that he said it again. "That's okay, John. I like your sister Karen, too." They laughed and both talked about how hard it was to admit it and how weird it was that their sisters shared the same name, Karen. John replied, "Yeah, I guess we are both caring for Karen." Jer agreed. "Beauty, eh?" Other times the four boys were separated. However, even when Ronnie was alone, he had Tina, the real, live, tiny tiger, kept in his pocket. Having a living, breathing creature with you has a way of diverting your attention. Tina kept encouraging him, and she was a reminder of how real the strange things they saw on Zoo Island were. Ronnie sat in the corner where the lights seemed to be a little better for some reason. The overhead lights, every once in a while, would flicker, blink, or go dim for a few seconds. A few of the strange boys that shared the cell block with Ron claimed that the lights went dim because the facility was using the electric chair to kill one of the kid convicts. Ron was pretty sure that was not true, and John confirmed that the electric chair wasn't even used in the adult jail, let alone at the youth detention center. Ron would remind himself of John's words. This state doesn't use the electric chair as a form of punishment." He'd play those words of comfort over and over again in his head like a mantra. This state doesn't use the electric chair as a form of punishment. This state doesn't use the electric chair as a form of punishment. This state doesn't use the electric chair as a form of punishment. When he was finally secure in believing the truth, he tried to tell Randy, one of the strange bad boys in the block. "Randy, it's well-known fact that the state doesn't even use the electric chair as a form of punishment." Ron also feared that he would not only pick up the ignorance, but somehow adopt the spoken accents of those around him. He didn't want what they said or how they said it to affect his writing. When Randy spoke, he replaced every L and R with the letter W. Ron almost couldn't hear what the kid was saying because of the way it was said. One day, Ron noticed something new. Every word that had a TH was replaced with the D sound. He cringed as Randy came back with, "Oh yeah? Well then, they must be using electronic shock therapy in this building. The next time the whites go dim, you know they are draining the electric from our block to drain the brain of some poor kid. You could be next." Randy, who called himself Wandy, and his little gang haunted Ronnie's young mind. He knew if he were to be around them too long, it would rot his head right off. He tried not to hang out with fools, but there seemed to be more foolish boys than literally wise guys in this dump. There aren't even any people here with a death sentence, but the whole fable about the electric chair was easily believed by most of the kids there. Most of the guards liked how easily the children were scared. They felt that the more fear they could generate, the more persuasion they possessed. In reality, if the truth be told, the bulbs overhead just needed to be changed, but the head guard over the staff neglected to put in a work order for that to be accomplished. Ron often thought how the bulbs weren't the only things that were dim and needed changing. The whole prison system needed some alteration. The changing of the guards would be the first logical step. There were many dull bulbs in the bunch. Regardless of all that, Ronnie could often be seen sitting in the corner all alone, writing with the only pencil he was given. The writing utensil was unlike anything he had ever seen or used before. The reason it was so weird was because it was made of all rubber, surrounding a small piece of graphite pencil lead. He marveled how it wasn't just a normal wooden pencil, the typical number 2 they used in school. The facility wouldn't give any inmate of the juvenile jail something that could definitely be turned into a weapon. When that little bit of lead in the tip broke or fell out, it was finished. Still, he made the best attempts at trying to just write. To write something, write anything, write whatever would serve him well, occupying his mind while his body's recreation was constrained by thick walls, bars, gates, and razor wire fences. Beyond all those factors in this corporate chaos, he and several others were truly more concerned that their brain was being starved, forced to experience all kinds of scholastic malnutrition. There is no real means of correction associated with this correctional facility. The hard, cold fact was that the children in these cages were simply being restricted for a certain amount of time that was supposed to somehow magically help, fix, or heal them. The lockdown alone was not capable of that, and sadly, everyone knew it, yet did nothing about it. The few people, mainly parents and pastors, who truly cared just hoped the young lives there would somehow find something or someone useful during their time living there. With each day came new challenges and changes, even though the routines of breakfast, mandatory classes, lunch, lockdown, dinner, and returning to lockdown again was always so mundane and ridiculously repetitive. Ronnie wished that he could write a few words and be done, but he knew it would take time and many words to properly explain things to their fullest. Just like John with his rubber pencil and paper, the whole picture is not completed with just a few scratches or smooth smears. It took many lines, shapes, and shades in order to connect it all into the best image describing what was before and around them. Another tool Ron and John used to escape was reading from the tightly restricted library. It was as limited as their liberty. The option of entertainment were so few, even Jeremy and Dave began to read. Sometimes a big, fat, dingy, dull-minded, unkept guard would come around with a little wheelie cart and that had a few books on it. That only happened once a month if they were lucky. Sometimes 3 months would go by until the morbidly obese book fairy showed up. A certain amount of excitement none of them had ever noticed before would rise in their guts and spring up to their shoulders at the sound of that squeaky-wheeled vehicle echoing through the halls, through the cell block. There was no real rhyme or reason as to when it would appear or what books it might carry. The same small group of boys seemed to grow each time it arrived, running and scavenging what they could from its only source of mental wealth. As Ron grabbed what he could, all too often he ended up with a book called Little Women. At first, each time, he thought he got the same book he had already read, but soon realized it was a series that followed the lives, the passageway of 4 girls maturing from childhood into adulthood, more specifically into womanhood. He smirked at the similarities of those 4 girls and his time with his gang of 4 boys. Although the main cover was ripped off, he still had to hide the front page the best he could, like it was some type of an adult porn book. He feared that if the other boys saw the title, Little Women, he'd have to endure their grand, relentless ridicule. He had some idea that the author, Louise May Alcott, was writing what she knew, her life with her 3 sisters. He mused over the details. Ronnie knew the best authors wrote what they knew, what they personally went through, the absurd blockades that allowed them to capture an unexpected outcome. That's what he always tried to do in his writing. In spite of the diagnosis of dyslexia, disability, and stunted growth, Ron was determined to get what was in his head out onto pages into a really real bound book, the kind that people could buy in an actual bookstore. He fantasized about going to the bookstore to sign novels he wrote, not just comic books he and his friends threw together. He didn't care so much about fame. He just wanted people to enjoy what he shared. For other readers to go through the same trip, meet the same characters that he cultivated and directed. Ron knew that to be a good or better writer, he would have to read more. Where the jail system lacked, the boys had to make attempts on their own end. It was up to each individual boy to gain an education. The homeschool type lessons were fed to them, but it was done with great reluctance on the end of the system's obligation, not from a teacher's heart to the children's head. It was more rote learning, memorizing facts, enough to just pass a test at the end, rather than retain lessons taught that would make them more productive young men who, when given the opportunity, could at least make a good, educated guess when questions they would face in real life presented themselves. Children need a well-rounded education and intellectual ability. The association between some economical poor individuals, poor decisions, health issues, and general lack of care for property is a mystery. Many less fortunate people seem to have no pride in what little they own. Too often they trashed what little they possessed. What was the link between lower education, poor finances, and trashiness? Our 4 boys were exposed to many different colors of trash, not just white trash. This secure location, designated as a place of punishment, housed young minds who were in dire need to gain an understanding of how valuable a good education is. There were so many important things they needed to learn in order to function and not just survive but thrive, progress in future occupations and careers. Meanwhile, as we said at the end of the prior Zoo BoyZ novel, Dave was learning his lesson the hard way, but he learned pretty quickly that everything couldn't be solved by fighting. He knew this because he lost a lot of battles. Even from within the small cells in the larger cell block, he found himself entering a little made-up contest. Who could do the most pull-ups? Who could do the fastest pull-ups? Who could do one-arm pull-ups? The top bunk of the bunk bed was the bar. If you didn't bend your knees, keeping your feet from touching the ground, it didn't count. They were always inside more than they were ever outside. One boy said he missed sunbathing. One of the boy's friends was already a father, and it was not uncommon for teenagers to have children. He talked about how much he missed his son. Another boy asks, what kid would miss bathing their son? No one bothered to explain the difference between bathing a son and sunbathing. There was an indoor gymnasium and a small outside area, but that was also enclosed. Even the ceiling was covered with a chain-link fence. As far as Jeremy was concerned, he had the most visitors. His sister Karen, who works for the newspaper, would come in most often. Her reason for visiting more than the others was driven by her personal agenda. She thought that perhaps she could write a story and feature it in the paper if they allowed it. If they wouldn't approve it, she could just independently publish her own book featuring the time her own brother, Jeremy, served. Jer was excited about that, especially if he was going to be in it. As she asked him questions, he recommended that John could do the illustrations. To that, his sister replied with a snooty response. Oh, dear Jer Bear, it's not that kind of book. Jeremy couldn't imagine anyone wanting to read a book without any pictures. Karen was filled with a strange mixture of shock and contempt as she gathered more than enough information from her brother that would surely expose the delinquency of this system in regard to their treatment of these juvenile delinquents. So far, the boys were only coming up on their first 12 months there. They still had 3 more years, 36 months, to go. On to Chapter 5.